Please welcome to the stage the Master of Ceremonies, Sissy Chow of The Observer.
Okay, welcome back. So to start this programming block, we'll look at business and human rights. Most people go to work every day. Most of us work for a private sector employer. Companies play an enormous role in protecting human dignity and advancing equity. This panel will look at how business leaders are building partnerships for meaningful impact. Please welcome to the stage Emmanuel Ohiri, UN Foundation advocate and sustainability expert, and our esteemed panel.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to have a great panel talking about human rights and the role of business in securing human rights. We have a great panel today of human rights advocates, policy professionals, and leaders who understand how businesses work and their role in everything. First, to introduce, we have Dr. Julia Ehrt, the Executive Director of ILGA World. She has been on the forefront of gender rights and advocacy in Europe, from trans issues to sexuality issues and women's rights across the continent. Next, we have Dr. Karthik Ranaman from the Oxford School, Blavatnik School of Management. Dr. Karthik has recently published a book called The Age of Outrage based on his class of managing organizations in polarizing times. And we're going to be relying on his leadership in understanding business and government relations. Next, we have Miss Lee Ann from Amazon. She is the Director of Human Rights and Social Impact, coming from 10 years in the State Department. She leads the company's human rights supply chain management to understand the impact that the company is making on people and environment. And lastly, we have Dr. Ana Rita Gonzalez with Policy Wisdom, who works as a public health professional and advising on businesses to understand the health risks of their operations. Amazing. Shall we get started?
Sure.
Perfect. So to go ahead and start, Julia, could you please tell me, with LGBTQI communities around the world today continuing to face discrimination and barriers that can block access to jobs, safety, and opportunity, what is the role of business from a point of advocating to them so we can go beyond statements and actually drive inclusion and protection for LGBTQ+ people?
Thanks, Emmanuel, and thanks for having me on this stage today. Before I go into what companies can do, maybe let's spend half a minute on what this discrimination looks like. We have 64 countries in the world that criminalize consensual same-sex relationships. Criminalization means there's sentences that range from prison sentences to the death penalty. We have governments that do not allow trans people to change name and gender in their ID cards. We have everyday violence in the streets among families. So that's what LGBTI people face. When we speak then about what companies can do, of course, face these kind of legal as well as violence and societal discrimination and obstacles has a deep impact on how people can show up for work. And if the employer does not provide an environment in which people can be who they are, they can't perform well. And that's bad for the persons, that's bad for the company, and that's bad for the business. So I would argue, in very short, the most important is that employers take their employees, their LGBTI employees, seriously and provide an environment in which they can be themselves the way how they want to be.
Thank you, thank you. And just quickly building off of that, and with your role in ILGA World, how do you get companies to do that? What is your modus of operation to really push for that?
Well, I mean, that's complicated because the world is a diverse place and we cover, the planet basically in our work. But of course, we advise companies on what are the very practical policy measures that can be taken and have to be taken in order to ensure what I just said. to just give you, I mean, there's many examples, and I mean, I could speak a whole hour probably only on that. But to give you an example, for example, there's a number of countries that criminalize, well, same-sex activities, and very often trans people are affected by that. There's countries that criminalize cross-dressing. So in this context, it's important, for example, to have policies that allow your employees to cross-dress at work, that to create an environment in which people can transition from one gender to the other at least within the context of your company, and to offer the same benefits to heterosexual couples that you offer to heterosexual couples, to offer them as well to gay and lesbian couples. So those are maybe a couple of things that companies can and should do, and we advocate with companies and advise them how to do that in practice.
Thank you. And as we go across with these questions for our panelists here, I also do want to encourage a conversation. If you have a point that you want to chime in on about some human rights aspect, gender rights aspect, please do chime in, even if it's not your particular focus. Next question for you, Karthik. In the age of outrage, you argue that many companies rely on symbolic gestures rather than real accountability. How can business leaders move from performative signaling, whether on environmental issues, gender issues, and other human rights issues, to actually embedding that responsibility in their core systems?
Yeah, that's a great question. And in my experience, the business of business is business. Just as we think about, in government, the separation of powers, and you say you've got an executive branch, a judicial branch, a legislative branch. In society, we have a role for business, which is economic activity and wealth generation, a role for governments, which is sensible regulation, lawmaking, et cetera, and a role for civil society, which is to advocate for justice and to ensure that those who are the weakest in society are not being trampled on by powerful forces. So there is obviously an important role for business to play in this space, but it's not going to be enough to build a fair and just society. It's not going to be enough to build a flourishing society. So to rely on business alone in addressing the challenges would be naive, and you'd be underwhelmed. There's a lot business can do, and there's a lot business does do. And some businesses, of course, are better at it than others. And part of what governments and civil society do is to sort of level up that and make sure the underperformers are not getting away with it and so forth. But there's a lot that governments and civil society ought to do as well. So in the context of what can we do to make businesses better for performing, for instance, in the to step outside the human rights space into the climate space, which is where I'm very involved right now, it is to create better metrics so that companies don't get away with effectively using, say, industry averages or regional average estimates. Imagine for a moment we said to companies, oh, you don't know what your profit is this period? No problem. Just report the industry average and we'll call it a day. We'd never let companies get away with something like that. So why would we let them get away with that in the context of some of the other things that we want businesses to be accountable for and to perform on? So building better metrics in that space is quite useful. But at the same time, there's going to be a limit to what businesses can do, and we shouldn't have unreasonable expectations on them because the role of business is sort of economic wealth creation rather than addressing inequalities that are generated as a result of that. That is where governments and civil society come in. So oftentimes the challenge comes in because we expect more of business than is legitimately possible given the functions of business.
That makes a lot of sense. And what you touched about, like having each sector have their own particular role and moving point and issue. At the UN, we have this philosophy of like a whole of society approach where you have an issue and you have to look at the comparative advantages almost to really push the point forward. And then to also mention about understanding where business is, what they can actually do and what we can actually expect of them. If you can touch on that a little bit more in the idea of sustainable development, sustainable growth from the business angle. Is that maybe a misnomer in terms of what we can expect from business, or what does sustainable growth actually look like with this understanding that you've given us?
Yeah, so sustainability in the context of a business is economic operations means, having the capacity and the ability to make long-term decisions. Right, so it's economic sustainability more than anything. And of course, sometimes and oftentimes, that economic sustainability is aligned with things like environmental sustainability or treating your workforce well. well, and affording all of the human dignity provisions that Julia mentioned. I mean, if you're a terrible employer in the long run, you won't be able to attract capital, and you won't be able to attract talent, and so you won't be able to be a great business. So in that sense, when we think about sustainability, it's absolutely a core part of what businesses that are in it for the long run ought to be doing, and in fact are often doing, right? I mean, you say the best performing businesses are those that take a long view on things. But at the same time, the very nature of business is to compete and to thrive and to dominate in their field. And that is, by definition, going to create inequality, right? I mean, Amazon is very good at what they do, and as a result, they are a big company. And because they became a big company, a lot of competitors no longer are in that marketplace. But that is the nature of business. In fact, we want companies to be successful like that because that's where our economic growth comes from. So then there will be another role. This goes back to what I said earlier. There'll be another role for governments and civil society to address those inequalities. And to expect somehow business to address that inequality undermines the very purpose of business, right? So that's how I would view that.
Thank you. And yeah, perfect segue going into that business angle. If you can tell us about your work at Amazon, and specifically, how do you balance that speed, growth, innovation with slower, deeper work of actually building equity, social contribution, social impact to the places in which Amazon operates?
Yeah, thank you. And I agree with Kartik that business cannot solve everything, all the societal issues on their own, but as business, we play a really important role. We need to partner with government and civil society, and that's really that partnership is the only way that we will achieve the types of social environmental outcomes that we'd like to see. So I couldn't agree more. At Amazon, I am responsible for human rights and social impact across the company. So how we do business responsibly, how we improve the social and human rights outcomes associated with our entire value chain. And obviously that's a huge mandate. To your point, I think the way that I achieve that at Amazon is by thinking about how the business operates. And so it's really critical for us. Amazon's a very customer-focused company. Customers are our number one priority, and we know that our customers want Amazon to be sustainable, want Amazon to be respectful of human rights, and so that's critical in terms of maintaining customer trust, maintaining our social license to operate in the countries in which we operate. So it is critical to our business success. But the way to do that is really through metrics, which is it's interesting you mentioned that, because when we talk about in the human rights community about embedding human rights due diligence into businesses, what that really means is how do you attach respect for human rights or an assessment of human rights impacts and human rights risk into everyday business operations so that it's just a way of doing business as opposed to layering on an additional sort of human rights program. It's more about how are we integrating into every part of our business? How are we making sure that that's one of the many metrics that each of our businesses at Amazon are looking at on a weekly basis? How are we, and this is why the impact metrics are so important. And that's something I think the entire business and human rights community is still working on. So how do we make sure that we have those impact metrics correct, that it's not just a guess, it's not just generalized statements, but that we actually understand what the impact of our programs are on human rights, on people and communities within our value chain.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And really quickly, I also want to ask you the same question I asked Julia, but from the business angle. As a U.S. company, and given the political pushback that we're currently seeing on diversity, equity, inclusion, more social impacts, climate in general, how has that changed your work at Amazon, if at all?
I would say it hasn't changed our work at all. We have a set of global human rights principles that guide Amazon's overall viewpoint on human rights and how we respect human rights at Amazon. Those have not changed. My program hasn't changed. There's constant political change all over the world. We're a global company, and so we have to adapt to where we're working all over the world. But my team is really focused on, again, those outcomes and those human rights outcomes and impacts that we still are focused on exactly the same goals.
Thank you. And now moving to Dr. Gonzalez. talking about public health, which I believe is something incredibly linked to human rights, but is often not platformed on the same level of other aspects of human rights. Tell us about your work with Policy Wisdom and how you are advising companies to integrate health risk assessments.
So health is a human right, and it's the most basic one. Without health, you cannot do anything else. But as a company, we work with our clients, so they use data to understand what are the vulnerabilities to human rights, and to identify if there are policy gaps, if there are trends, how do they manifest? And then we use a lot of scenario planning to help them see if this is your business decision, this exacerbates or this mitigates a human right issue. So that it is understood, because human rights strategy is as core as business growth strategy. They come hand in hand, as you were saying. So we help them understand all of the data and do that. But as a company also, we're a small business. We're only 40 people around the world, but we do what we tell others to do. We're multicultural. Everybody is included in our decisions. Everybody has the right to say what they think, to be who they want to be, to come to work whatever they want to, in whatever way they want to be, because that respect and that way of being really helps others see when you're advising them that is doable.
No, I'm really glad that you mentioned, data-based understanding of what these actual risks are, like kind of in a way to put a number on what benefit this will bring. And we heard from Kartik and also Anna here, Leanne, about the importance of integrating those kind of metrics in the business's decision so the business can concretely, numerically operationalize that. Can you tell us then, with your experience in advising on companies with this data and science-backed approach, what does effective cooperation actually look like between companies and governments and civil society?
I think my three panelists here have said the same thing. This cannot be done by one group or by two actors. Everybody has to have a part on it. And good collaboration happens when we all bring what we know how to do, what to do. And we respect that others know how to do things that we don't know how to do. So the collaboration only happens when that respect and that not only respect for each other, but respect for the knowledge that each one brings to the table comes in. But also collaboration has a lot to do with understanding that our methods of doing things have to change. So if you are a government, if you are a UN agency, whoever you are in that space, you're not anymore singing what needs to be done. You need to consider what business want to do. You need to consider what non-governmental organizations and advocates want to do. So you need to make sure that the conversations allow for everyone not to just bring their knowledge, but to also help build the solutions for that. Because at the end of the day, sustainability cannot be achieved without policies. Policy is that one thing that ensures that something is broad and is sustainable. And you cannot try to make that by yourself, because what happens is that people will not follow because they don't believe in what you're saying.
That is really key, that policy angle as well, across civil society, governments, business, right? Like, what is the rule, the regulation on this, right? And having it, that's the link between those things.
Because you make a decision in a boardroom, or you make a decision in a regulatory agency, and you decide that someone cannot have access to a medicine or to a vaccine, or you decide that you would not reimburse a therapy for someone that is gender transitioning. Right then and there, you're not following the rights. So those decisions need to be really tested to make sure that they are supporting growth, but also supporting human rights.
Very nice. And I think I also wanted to come back to you, Julia, kind of building off on that, and also what you said, Leanne, about given the political pressures that you're facing all over the world, with just how things change, but the work stays the same. How does your advocacy root in helping businesses maintain and sustain their human rights commitments, whether it's environmental, gender, or otherwise?
I think the problem that businesses at the moment facing with the truncation of DEI is, well, one, complex. And maybe I should say that I believe, you do not need, a DEI policy is great, but you do not need a DEI policy to safeguard, or support your staff across various issues of vulnerability. But the push against DEI that we're seeing needs to be countered by businesses. Now, Karthik just mentioned it's in the nature of businesses to compete. So, but how do you push back against, a government imposing legislation? You come together. This is what civil society does. You come together. You build solidarity. You build a common goal and a common cause that then gives pressure to governments. So, but the competition aspect, is the basis of companies. So it's not in their nature to compete and to push back, but an individual government and an individual corporation does not stand a chance against a government. So it would require for companies to come together and hold at least a certain level of ground. But unfortunately, that's not what we're seeing at the moment. But I think that would be the calling of the current moment, as well for companies, as it is for civil society, for that matter.
Amazing. Thank you so much. We are coming up on the end of our panel here, and I want to give our amazing panelists just a brief moment to give any final reflections or talk about what's really important.
Can I go first?
Okay. So I think the most important thing about human rights is that they are core to everything we do. We make it part of our DNA, because if we don't make it part of our DNA, it's a swing. When things are going well, we forget. When things are going bad, we push forward. So to me, it's making it part of your DNA and using data to convince those that are not convinced.
Amazing.
I couldn't agree more. You said it so perfectly. I think that's right, and I love working with experts like the three doctors here I'm on the panel with, because it's so important for us as a company to rely on experts in the human rights community to help inform our practices and to help us put data behind the policies and the programs that we're adopting, and I think it's so critical from the sort of the premise of your book that we are actually taking measurable action. It's not just about making statements and adopting policies. While important as like a first step, is not the real work, and it's actually getting into the weeds. So I'm excited about that.
So the panel is business and human rights, and I think the last word I would leave folks with is both are essential to driving human flourishing, and so we shouldn't forget, both of those.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I would echo that. Think in long terms, and human flourishing requires, a basic human rights framework, and that needs to be maintained long term. So, that's it.
Thank you so much. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.